Inside the Jeffrey Epstein network, what we know and what was never explained. Most people didn't know the name Jeffrey Epstein until it was suddenly everywhere, dominating headlines, conversations, and questions that didn't have clear answers. But by the time the world finally paid attention, the story had already been unfolding for decades in the background, moving quietly through circles of power, influence, and wealth that most people will never see up close. And what made it unsettling wasn't just what happened, but how long it happened without interruption, without exposure, and without consequence. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand what's really happening behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this don't end where the news stops. They just get harder to find. Jeffrey Epstein did not come from a background that clearly explained his eventual position in elite financial and social networks. And unlike most individuals who reach that level of influence, there is no widely accepted, transparent account of how he accumulated his wealth or secured his connections. Because his early career began in a relatively ordinary way as a teacher before transitioning into finance, where he quickly began working with extremely wealthy clients. And from that point forward, his trajectory became increasingly difficult to trace in a conventional sense, as he positioned himself not as a public businessman, but as a private financial manager dealing with high-net-worth individuals whose identities were often not disclosed publicly. As his wealth and access expanded, so did his physical presence across multiple high-profile locations, including a large mansion in Manhattan, a waterfront estate in Palm Beach, a private island in the Caribbean, and a ranch in New Mexico. And these properties were not just symbols of wealth, but according to later investigations and victim testimonies, they became part of a recurring structure, a system that functioned across locations with similar patterns, where individuals were transported, scheduled, and managed in ways that suggested coordination rather than randomness. And this is where the case begins to shift from an individual story into something that feels organized. Because the consistency across different environments raises the question of how such a system could be maintained over time without attracting sustained intervention. As more information surfaced, it became clear that Epstein did not operate in isolation, and one of the most central figures associated with him was Ghislaine Maxwell, whose role extended beyond social association into something more operational, as court proceedings and testimonies later indicated her involvement in recruitment and facilitation. And beyond her, there were layers of individuals who existed within the structure, including household staff, assistants, pilots, and drivers, all of whom contributed to the functioning of the environment in different capacities. And while not all individuals in those roles were accused of wrongdoing, their presence highlights the logistical reality that a system of this scale required coordination, scheduling, and movement that could not have been sustained by one person alone. The first major public disruption to this system occurred in 2005, when a report was made to police in Palm Beach, Florida, initiating an investigation that would uncover multiple allegations involving underage girls. And as the investigation progressed, more individuals came forward, describing similar experiences and patterns, which strengthened the case and led local authorities to build charges, eventually drawing the attention of federal agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And at that stage, it appeared that the situation was approaching a comprehensive legal resolution. But what followed instead became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. In 2008, Epstein entered into a plea agreement that allowed him to avoid federal prosecution by pleading guilty to lesser state charges, resulting in a sentence that included time in a county jail, but under conditions that were widely viewed as unusually lenient, as he was permitted work release that allowed him to spend significant portions of his day outside the facility. And this outcome drew criticism from legal experts, journalists, and the public. because the scale of the allegations seemed disproportionate to the resolution. And for many observers, this moment marked a turning point where the case shifted from a criminal investigation into something that raised broader questions about influence, access, and the limits of accountability when power is involved. Following his release, Epstein registered as a sex offender, but he continued to maintain aspects of his lifestyle and connections. And while the case receded from major headlines, it did not disappear entirely. As victims continued to pursue legal action and journalists continued to investigate, gradually bringing new attention to the inconsistencies and unanswered questions surrounding the original case. And over time, the accumulation of these efforts led to renewed scrutiny, setting the stage for what would become the second major phase of the investigation. In 2019, federal prosecutors in New York brought new charges against Epstein, based on additional evidence and testimonies that extended beyond the scope of the earlier case. And this time, the legal approach was significantly more aggressive, reflecting both the seriousness of the allegations and the increased public awareness surrounding the case. And when Epstein was arrested, it marked a moment where it appeared that the full extent of the situation might finally be examined in court. With the possibility of testimony, evidence, and legal proceedings that could clarify many of the uncertainties that had persisted for years. After his arrest, Epstein was held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a facility designed to house high-profile inmates under strict security conditions. And given the nature of his case, he was initially placed under suicide watch, a status that involves close monitoring to prevent self-harm. But reports later indicated that he was removed from suicide watch prior to his death, which is a detail that has been widely discussed because it intersects with what happened next in a way that has never been fully resolved in the public mind. In August 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell and was later pronounced dead, with the official ruling determining the cause as suicide. But almost immediately, the circumstances surrounding his death became the subject of intense scrutiny, as multiple procedural failures were reported within the facility, including lapses in required monitoring, malfunctioning or unavailable security camera footage, and deviations from standard protocol by staff. And while investigations were conducted into these failures, the convergence of multiple breakdowns at the same time created a situation that many found difficult to reconcile with expectations for a high-security environment. To this day, the Epstein case remains one of the most discussed and debated stories in recent history, not only because of the crimes that were documented, but because of the broader context in which they occurred, including the length of time over which the activities continued, the number of individuals required to sustain the system logistically, and the connections that placed Epstein within proximity to influential figures across different sectors. And while many of those individuals have not been accused of wrongdoing, their association with Epstein has contributed to the perception of a network that extended beyond what was fully examined in court. After Epstein's death, legal proceedings continued in relation to others connected to the case. Most notably, Ghislaine Maxwell, who was later arrested, tried, and convicted on charges related to her role in the network, and her trial provided additional confirmation of certain aspects of the system, including recruitment and coordination. But even with that outcome, the overall picture remained incomplete in the eyes of many observers, because the central figure who might have provided direct testimony regarding the full scope of the operation was no longer alive. What continues to make this case persist in public consciousness is not just the facts that have been established, but the gaps that remain between what is known, what was alleged, and what was never fully explored in a courtroom setting. Because when a situation involves multiple locations, repeated patterns, logistical coordination, and connections that span different areas of influence, It naturally leads to questions about scale, structure, and the mechanisms that allowed it to continue for as long as it did. And while definitive answers may not exist for every aspect of the case, the combination of documented events and unresolved elements has ensured that it remains a subject of ongoing analysis, discussion, and speculation. And when you step back and look at the entire timeline, from the early formation of Epstein's financial access to the development of his network, the initial investigation and its limited resolution, the years of continued activity, the renewed charges, and finally the circumstances of his death, what emerges is not a simple narrative with a clear beginning and end, but a sequence of events that leaves behind as many questions as it answers. And those questions do not disappear, because they point towards something larger than any single individual, something rooted in systems, environments, and structures where visibility is limited and accountability is not always immediate. Because if one individual, operating largely outside of public scrutiny, could build and maintain a system that functioned across multiple locations and over an extended period of time, involving enough coordination to sustain its operations, then the question is not only about what happened, but about the conditions that allowed it to happen, the environments where connections are formed and maintained, and the places where influence operates without constant observation. And it is within those environments that the next layer of this story begins. Because there are locations where individuals at the highest levels of power gather privately, away from public visibility, in settings that are not easily accessed or understood from the outside. One of those places is known as Bohemian Grove. And understanding what happens in environments like that is often considered the next step in trying to understand how networks of influence are formed, maintained, and protected over time. The truth is, stories like this don't really end. They just stop being explained. So if you want to keep going deeper into the parts most people avoid, make sure you're subscribed, because this is only the beginning.